Yes, sir.
Would you please introduce a bill and reestablish the Wisconsin Territory?
Tommy Thompson used to always come to Hudson when he was running, and yeah, I was his campaign chair in St. Croix County years ago now. And he would always come here and he would talk about, yeah, we never should have let that go over there. No. For those of you that don't know, the decision when it was all Wisconsin territory, the decision that had to be made was where will you draw the western border of Wisconsin? And it was going to either be all the way to the Mississippi and then from the headwaters up to International Falls. That was one option. Or the other option was that you'd use the St. Croix. So they chose the St. Croix. And in an unusual twist, all this area where we stand here, where we're east of the Mississippi, and then everything north, which is probably a good chunk of where you all live, you know, that was kind of in limbo. So after Wisconsin became a state, there was still Wisconsin territory, and they sent to Congress representatives from both for a while. But no, that's not going to change back. We follow what happens in Minnesota very closely. I often come back to them, you know, say minimum markup on gasoline and other things. And I just said to them right now, our minimum markup is archaic and it's way too high. And you've gone down and up and so on, but actually yours is lower than ours. And I've tried to get them to follow that. And I think we might have a chance of actually moving towards you. But it's a big issue. If you believe in markets and freedom, it's pretty hard to justify having a law that says, in Wisconsin, here's what it says. It's just craziness. You got to mark up 3% on the wholesale level, and you got to mark up 6% at the gas station, and oh, guess what? You only get to change the gas price once a day. If you change it more than that, that might be too competitive, and so it's just nuts. Anyway, yes, sir.
Do I understand right that you feel as though that a safety net should not become a hammock?
That's a good point.
I don't put it that way.
You want to know if a safety net should become a hammock?
I don't put it that way, but I will tell you this, that we need to have a safety net because there's always going to be those among us that can't care for themselves, right? That something has befallen them either in their health or they're just not going to be able to care for that. It's always going to be, and we are always going to care for them. But what you don't want to have is a safety net that looks so attractive that it essentially has a big target on it and makes you want to get in it somehow. Here's one of the problems with Obamacare, and it is a significant problem, okay? If you're on Medicaid, you weren't being asked to pay much of anything. Some states now have got a minimal premium there. But then once you get up to where you're going to be on the exchange, in Minnesota, 138% of the poverty line. In Wisconsin, it's at 100. You're asked to pay based on your income. You've got out-of-pocket expenses based on your income, but you've got skin in the game to a completely different level. I was on Wisconsin Public Radio one day debating this with someone who called in and said, "Oh, I just think you're wrong." And I said, "Well, what's your experience?" And the guy says, "Well, I've been driving a taxi, but now I don't take very many shifts anymore because I'm afraid I might make too much, and I'm not on Medicaid anymore." Now, what does that sound like to you? Is that a safety net? I don't know if it's a hammock, but we can't have disincentives to work, because if we have disincentives to work like that, where people are calculating their hours or their pay or their willingness to take a risk, then our country is going to go on a downward slide, because you've got too many people that are dependent and not enough people that are out stepping out and working. And this was built into Obamacare. There isn't any real way to deal with it. You've watched red state governors now from Iowa to Utah to Indiana to Ohio. They've all tried to figure out a way to make that not such a steep thing where you're charging a similar premium, but you aren't allowed to have big out-of-pocket expenses or anything like that. So there's always a steep divide there, and that was a failure from the beginning. I tell you what, the Affordable Care Act, while it was well-intentioned, and I'm sure that they had laudable goals, from the standpoint of a constitutional conservative, you couldn't have hit anything more insulting to the principles that we stand for.
Thank you.
Further questions, Representative Knudsen? What's your question? Over to you.
The most freedom issue in America today is Common Core. And I would like to know, because I hear this back and forth, where Governor Walker stands on that issue. I mean, if you could have listened to Dr. Pesta speak a couple weeks ago, he's an educator in your system down there in Oshkosh.
Right.
And it is such an insidious, invasive thing. It takes away the freedoms of kids to think they're being made to work and work in the government system. And so Common Core has got to be a key issue in the upcoming legislative session.
Okay, she wants to know more about what Governor Walker thinks on Common Core and the importance of Common Core as a key issue in the legislative session and challenging Common Core.
Well, kudos to Minnesota for actually evaluating the math standards and deciding that they were better off to keep their own standards. So I don't know if you're aware of that, but Minnesota didn't adopt the math Common Core because there was a process in place, didn't do it. I mean, education ought to be local, it's best controlled locally, and if it's not going to be local, then it ought to be done on a state level. As long as we've gotten to a system where there's as much state funding as there is, it's pretty difficult to keep some separation and not have some state control there or state, at least accountability to the taxpayers that are having their money taken into the capital over here and then spread out everywhere. So there's that. I'm not Governor Walker, but I can tell you what I know about this is that he started off believing, just as Jeb Bush and Bobby Jindal and a lot of other people, I mean, he really believed that Common Core was a step in the right direction because our previous standards were so low, and our standards in Wisconsin were extremely low. We had a test called the WKCE that had gotten, the norming of this test had gotten so far out of whack that you know that if you had a median on a test, half the kids should be above it and half the kids were below it. Well, this thing was telling about 2/3 of the children that they were above average. So that was really, it was kind of, it's what I call Lake Wobegon testing, right? All the women are strong and the men good looking. Or maybe that's only in Minnesota, but right? So he changed. I mean, he had brought in, his chief education advisor was a big Common Core fan. Okay? The guy's name is Michael Brickman, and he's now number 3 at the Fordham Institute, and the Fordham Institute is like big Common Core supporter. But Governor Walker changed, and you know, I would give him credit for this. It took a little while, but ultimately he came out during this last election and said we ought to have standards should be up to local school districts, which they really should be. And now in his budget, he put in the wording that smarter balance shall not be used anywhere in the state of Wisconsin. We'll see whether that happens, but that was pretty much all he can do. You can see in Wisconsin, we don't have a state school board, so you know, the guy who adopted it never really had the power and authority to adopt it. And that was our state superintendent of public instruction. So it's a little bit different. But all the districts, we have 424 school districts, they were all led to believe they'd lose state funding if they didn't do it, so they all did it. And now we've had one school board who took a vote and said, no, we're not doing this, and I think you'll see more. And the smarter balance has turned into just, it's not been good. So I agree with you, though, in the coming presidential election, there is no bigger proponent than Jeb Bush. So if you believe that there's a liberal party and a conservative party, I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't used any R or Ds here out of respect for the fact that you're nonpartisan. But it is good that you're nonpartisan, but we can still say if you believe that in that election there will be a conservative party and there will be a more liberal party, there is a battle for the soul of that more conservative party that's going to happen, right? And there is no bigger proponent of Common Core. I've talked with Jeb Bush personally about it. I mean, he believes in it. He is a true blue believer in Common Core, and there's no backing down. So, I mean, I think you're going to see a pretty clear distinction on that issue. Yes, Rip.
Two questions quickly. Have you attempted to get rid of local government paid lobbyists where they use local government taxpayer money to lobby more taxpayer money from you? Have you attempted to get rid of that? And secondly, with the right to, or the Act 10 effort, what did you do to help the wayward, squishy people kind of come along with the program?
Okay, what did they do to get the wayward, squishy people to go along with Act 10? Let's start with that.
Okay. You know, there was very little pressure exerted, but because there was so much external pressure going on, that made it harder to sort of cave. I know that seems counterintuitive, but the external pressure for most of us, I mean, I would liken it to, do you remember 9/11? There were a couple of responses. I mean, the Americans were either afraid that they were going to be attacked, and so they were kind of fearful, or under pressure, they sort of stood up and said, no, I won't have that. I mean, you're going to push me like this, then I will stand firm. And that was kind of what I think the majority of our country did. And it was almost like that for us. We didn't have a lot of top-down pressure from leadership. I mean, one of those members that I mentioned ended up voting no. I mean, I was asked by the speaker to come and sit down and see if I could convince him. But you know what? We all vote our districts and we vote our conscience, and you know, people, they come to a point. But we came together in a way through that whole thing. I mean, there was a moment in caucus when, I mean, honestly, after you've been threatened and bullied and banged around, I mean, and it literally was like that. I mean, at one point they had the chancellors from our universities come in for a briefing on this, and they made the mistake of wearing ties. And one of them literally got knocked to the ground and banged up because he didn't realize what was going to happen if he walked into these thousands of people who assumed he was of the wrong party, right? And after a while, that led to people having a lot of spine and backbone over the whole issue. I mean, we just realized it's got to get done. There's no... Now, we haven't stopped the paid lobbyists. We have the Wisconsin Counties Association, the Wisconsin Towns Association, the League of Cities, Municipalities, and on, the school boards. We've got them all, and they're all doing it, and we should change it, but we haven't.
Any other questions for Representative Knudsen? I have one from the House Majority Leader.
Thank you so much for your very inspirational words. We've had a lot of difficult issues, but nothing that has taken anywhere near the amount of courage you've taken there. So thank you. Obviously, our political landscape is a little different here, and how can one of the things that you have that we don't have is a governor, and we don't have the Senate either. What would you, if you were to be a campaign manager for someone running for governor of Minnesota, what would you say to that person? In other words, how can we get a Republican elected governor in Minnesota?
Now, the majority leader, out of respect, I'm going to just answer a question, but I only got a little bit of guidance about the speech, and it was, don't talk so much about how to get people elected, right, John?
That was
But I'll do it anyway. I wasn't sure if that's sort of out of bounds. The landscape's different in a couple of ways. I mean, and let me tell you a couple significant things here. One is that while Minnesota is bigger geographically, we have just a few more people. And the consequence of how much bigger you are is that we have about 50% higher population density. And it's particularly high down in the southeast. In Milwaukee, Madison, and then down towards the Chicago suburbs. And so that 50% density changes things. So for example, radio. Radio in Wisconsin, talk radio, is an enormously powerful thing. I don't know that you could relate to it. So in Minnesota, you've got a large radio, in the top 200 radio markets in the United States, Minneapolis-St. Paul is number 16. It's the only one in the state of Minnesota that's in the top 200. We have 5 different radio markets. In the Milwaukee market alone, we have Charlie Sykes, for example. Charlie's show has over a 10 share. Rush Limbaugh and Jason Lewis at their peak probably had a 2-3 share. So this means that in every given week, 1 million people out of the 5 million people in our state listen to Charlie Sykes at least once. And so when he starts talking about right to work, I'll tell you what, he can change minds. Now, you don't have anything like that. I know I'm in your radio market. I mean, I've listened to Joe Souchere, and I've listened to Jason Lewis, and you just don't have it. It changes things. So it's harder to sort of get a message out there, and you get sort of a media reverb. In the rest of that country, that is big, but it's kind of lacking, and unfortunately, it might have been better at a point when Jason was doing those tax cut rallies. I mean, he was pretty Minnesota focused, but then later that changed a little bit, and we have intense focus. So Charlie Sykes is number one, and you go below him, there's about 4 or 5 others that have huge listenerships, and that changes things. So I don't know what you can do about that, but you can accept the fact that the media is out, the mass market, major mainstream media is always against you, right? It's always liberal. So, I remember when the story came out with the tipping the waitresses and the pennies and all of that, and that was just a disaster. And I mean, I can say that as an observer from near, but with distance, that was a disaster because there's no way to get a positive message out on that. Well, what was he really trying to say? What was his message? It actually made a lot of sense to me. It might have been inarticulate at the time. But instead, you've got this liberal media that just destroys it, right? You're going to have somebody who is unflinching in his conservative principles, his or hers. Somebody like you. Yeah. That's what it will take. And you will not elect someone from the Conservative Party who is a mushy moderate, who's just barely there and is in the Republican Party. There, I said it for the first time, I'm sorry, but you asked me a political question. And that just won't happen. I don't see that. I mean, it may have happened some years ago, and I know you had a number of, and I don't count TimLEAQuestions in that group, but I mean, before that, you had some others. And there was always this idea that that's the only way, but no, I think it'll actually be someone that's articulate, that has charisma, that will stand up for conservative principles, and then hopefully you've got someone that's really weak on the other side, and they've way overstepped and raised taxes and greatly increased government, and then this magic moment can come. And, unfortunately, you got to wait for 3.5 years. But I mean, as far as how, I mean, that's the how. And you've got this media challenge to get over. So that's harder. So we honestly see. Here's another difference for us in our states is, and I said before, I've lived in all your border states. I mean, I was born in North Dakota. I lived in South Dakota. I went to school in Iowa. I live in Wisconsin. I've lived around the periphery and watched Minnesota. We have similarly borders, but we've got big states. We've got we're both like mid states in the 20s, and we have a giant just next door in Illinois, number 5, and then we have Michigan's number 10, and we count Indiana as a neighbor. It's like 50 miles across the lake, but it's a neighbor, and we watch Indiana, and Indiana is a bigger state. So we have these bigger states that have sort of similar demographics and history. You've got kind of the heavy manufacturing and some of that and changing, but if you'll watch Michigan and Indiana and Ohio, you can see Wisconsin kind of following along. And then you've got Minnesota, and you're just so much bigger than all the surrounding states that it's a little bit different. It's harder for you to get the same kinds of, we will follow Indiana, right? When Governor Walker first told me about Act 10, I was tasked with changing collective bargaining. And I was scared about what it was because I had been having trouble getting traction. And he took me aside one day and he said, well, don't worry, I'm going to do something big on this, and it's going to be like Mitch Daniels did in his first term. He has Mitch Daniels following. He hasn't cut the 18% of the state employees like Mitch Daniels did in his first term, but yeah, I mean, so that's the path. It can be done.
One more question from the audience?
We're a caucus and a primary state, and we shoot ourselves in the foot for a good part of the whole political season. What do you have in Wisconsin? Is it a caucus or primary state? And you've seen it from just across the river. What thoughts do you have relative to the whole caucus versus primary stuff?
Caucus versus primary, the differences.
So Wisconsin's been a leader in a lot of things, and I'm not bragging about any of these, but so the income tax started in Wisconsin a couple years later, federal income tax. Unemployment, workers' comp. One of my first votes where I kind of distinguished myself amongst our caucus was we were taking the vote where we're gonna extend unemployment. And we were at, I think, 88 weeks, and we were gonna go another 26 weeks or whatever it was. We were gonna end up in the high 100s, and there were 7 of us that voted against that. And now, in hindsight, the studies have shown the states that didn't do that, actually, they came out and they had fuller employment faster because of that, which made a lot of sense to me at the time. But we were the first in the nation to have party primaries. It's an idea that started in Wisconsin. It's probably not going to go away anytime soon, so that's how we do it. We for years, we didn't even have an endorsement at the party level. Didn't even have an endorsement. I mean, we probably could have beaten Russ Feingold 6 years earlier if we had had something. But at the state convention, we were going to try this idea of endorsing there, and before it was all over, they called off the vote because the guy that they had picked they thought was going to win wasn't winning, so they just stopped the whole thing. Said, no, we'll just go to the primary. And in the primary, the young insurgent won, and he probably would have won the whole thing and beaten Feingold if we'd have just let him be picked earlier. And so that's one of our challenges. We did move the primary up a little bit, partly due to HAVA laws and things. So we used to be in September, and there was just so little time. And whereas you have an earlier caucus endorsement, which could let you get behind a candidate earlier, but the risk is it's hard to judge their electability from the people that come through the caucus system. It's just like we were talking over here, so-and-so didn't advance in the caucus because of 2 votes or something, and it's the people that end up voting, you get a very narrow slice. Whereas for us, you get a pretty representative thing. Take Rebecca Clayfish, our lieutenant governor, okay? She was a complete underdog. She had spoken at Tea Party rallies, but other than that, she had no political experience at all. And she was an underdog. There was a very well-placed, long-standing representative who was the choice of all the inside establishment, but no, Rebecca Clayfish won. For one, she had this grassroots that got behind her. For 2, she got talk radio behind her. And for 3, she ran a better campaign, which you can't tell how they're going to run the real campaign by the caucus endorsement process, because it's so different from a real campaign, I think. And so that primary is more like, hey, let's have a scrimmage, let's actually see what you can do. Can you put together a statewide race or not? And if you can, then you're probably more likely to win. So we tend not to be afraid of, if you watch what happened in choosing Governor Walker's opponent, here's how the Democrats in Wisconsin did it. They had over 24 focus groups. And at the first focus groups, they said, without thinking of any particular person in mind, what would be the characteristics of the ideal candidate? And well, it was going to be a woman who had some money, had a little government experience, but wasn't currently in government, on and on and on. You need to be from certain counties. And they kept refining that, and as it got refined, they went out looking for the person, and they chose Mary Burke. And Mary Burke, in the end, wasn't really ready for prime time, but they had chosen her. They muscled out all the other candidates by saying, no, we won't give you any party support. Whereas on our side, if you watch what has happened, I mean, you watch Ron Johnson, when he ultimately beat Russ Feingold, we went from the most liberal senator to one of the most conservative all in that 2010 election, and we also elected all the state officials. But if you watch what happened with Ron Johnson, no one would have predicted he was going to win. But again, what was his background? Never held elected office. He'd been a speaker at Tea Party rallies. He had some money. That didn't hurt. But he was just a regular guy. I mean, the first time I took one of my friends to talk with him, and he's a big NRA Second Amendment guy like I am, and he said to him, well, you know, what's your position on the Second Amendment? And Senator Johnson said, I'm not really a gun guy, I've got a fishing pole. And my friend was like, what, how am I supposed to support him? I said, he's not a politician. He's probably never been asked that before. He's just a regular guy that is so incensed over Obamacare and the federal government's involvement where it doesn't belong that he wants to go to Washington. Ask him that again in a few months and he'll have a better answer, and that's what happened. He got better and better and better, and he won that primary. And then he was good enough to win in the general, so I like primaries. How's that? Long answer.
I agree, it was a long answer, but we were very informative. Does Wisconsin have a closed primaries?
Well, so what happens in the primaries, you can only vote one party for all. So if you decide to cross over, because we don't have party registration, so you're not registered as a particular, so you can cross over, and there is sometimes some mischief there, but if you cross over, then you gotta, vote for all of them. So we end up making sure that we have a primary on both sides so that you don't get as much mischief. So if you can see a primary coming on then sometimes we have actually gone so far as to run fake liberals in order to make sure that there's a primary. I mean, somebody will say, okay, well, I'll run over there because it just keeps them home and stops the mischief.
Yeah, that's kind of a consequence of the manipulative system there with the what you have to do with the primaries, but it's very good to hear from you. The primaries, I did want to mention just that if it enhances competition, competitive elections are good, and we need competitive elections, and we need challenges to incumbents. And challenges, and people need to be held accountable. I was just talking about the staggered elections earlier, talking about the competitive elections now, so be careful about trying to get everything, the election cycle extended even longer and longer, making it harder for challengers. I know if you're incumbents, it's not necessarily a nice message to hear, but when you have competitive elections, you get better representation, and you get more accountability. If you have elections where the primary is moved to late spring, and then the filing date is moved to early March, half the session takes place after the filing deadline, and people can cast votes knowing they will have no principled opposition at all. I wrote about this in the Pioneer Press a couple of years ago, so and it makes it harder for groups like us to get the word out and evaluate the legislature as well. So it's something to think about. You've got all kinds of election issues, and you hope they don't all get rolled into one bill. I've heard that is the push for early voting, like making 15 days early voting period. Yes, indeed, our wonderful Steve Simon. But the opposition saying, well, we just kind of liberalized things a little bit last election. Let's maybe wait, let's see what happens. I don't know if that's going to be good enough. I mean, we have to have a strong principled message of what we have to do in terms of elections, in terms of making it easy for people to get involved and to cast principled votes, not only as legislators, but in the process, and be able to support people as they go along.